Good evening, Cedar Falls, and welcome to tonight's committee meeting for Finance and Business Operations Committee. I call this meeting to order with a roll call from Madam Clerk.
Schultz.
Here.
DeBoer.
Here.
Cruz. Harding.
Here.
Anfield.
Here.
Sayers.
Here.
Dunn.
Here.
Cruz absent.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Tonight's agenda includes a presentation from Director Rodenbeck regarding the fiscal year 2024 budget and what that might look like with the unknowns still in play.
Okay. Yeah, so tonight's probably a little different than normal. We would probably had a lot more to come and talk about tonight, but because a lot of things going on at the state level, probably just really kind of just doing a little bit of a prelude, so to speak, to the budget process. But we thought, about instead of putting everything on pause, maybe it'd be still a good idea just to come, give a little bit of overview, kind of where we're at so far. Probably just even for the public's interest to talk a little bit about the legislation and why we're on pause, just so maybe people out in the public understand that reason too. So I guess I'll just kind of jump right in. So the normal budget process is October, November, departments submit their requests to finance. November and December, city council's holding their goal setting, outlining, different goals that they have, parameters. December, we know we have to do our TIF certification. December and January, we're reviewing and approving the CIP. Then in January, usually right at the first of the year, Blackhawk County gives us our valuations. We can start finalizing our revenues. And then usually in February, early March, City Council holds public hearings, and we are required to have 2 hearings now. And so we're usually doing that, and then to get our budget filed with the county and the state of Iowa by the end of March. However, this year, we do have going down at the State House, SSB 1056. It's actually now been renamed to Senate File 181 and House Bill 120. And that's kind of made us pause a little bit on our budget process. So just to give people just a little bit of overview, what that means is, so in early October, the state announces their rollback figures, and that's the amount that people are taxed, whether it's the commercial, residential, industrial, ag land. And so they release those rollback figures, and for residential it was 56.49%. However, the legislation intended that calculation should have included or exempted the multi-residential properties. So they're talking about now that they really have to do a correction to that rollback figure and saying it's at 54.65%. So again, even though it's going through the legislative process, they would explain that it's not really new legislation, it's a correction more. I think for all of us, we understand that the problem is they're doing that right where we're kind of right when we were trying to start our budget. A lot of people had already started their budget, and so that's really the tough part about it. Also, when you take that rollback, if you take our residential valuations, if you instead of having the 56, if you take that times the 54.65, that is a $430,000 loss to our general fund. So it is a significant recalculation and will have a significant impact on us. That's why, again, we kind of felt like where are we at with the budget then. So has already passed the Senate. House had a subcommittee on it today. They talk about that their hope is to get it to the governor's desk by February 10th. Now, unfortunately, after that means that then the counties will have 10 to 15 days to redo all the valuation amounts and then get us what our new valuation is, and it's kind of like we can kind of start over at that point. So, again, this is what kind of told us that at this point, do we just have to put a little bit of a pause on our budget because we don't want to proceed ahead with some publication and notices, and then we have to start over because of the new amounts. Now, the good news is, it sounds like, the Senate bill did have it in there that they would extend our normal deadline to April 30th, and it sounds like the House subcommittee is willing to talk about that too, extending the deadline, so that's the good thing about it. So again, we're kind of on pause for tonight, little different than normal. Like I said, we would have liked to been here and proceeding ahead with giving you some proposed where we think we're at with our budget, but at a pause. Now, I will tell you that in sitting through the subcommittee last week for the Senate subcommittee, the state has been taking a little bit of responsibility for how this happened, lack of communication that transpired. So I don't know that that makes anyone feel better, but I think that's why they're also allowing for the extended deadline as well. So again, I just put in here that really, since the unknown about the rollback and taxable valuations, it's really just reviewing some of the parameters tonight for the budget and some preliminary estimations. So all of you have kind of seen this chart before. It's just kind of a reminder about if I'm a citizen and I want to know what I'm going to pay for my taxes, it really is made up of three parts. What's the valuation of my home or business? What's the rollback that the state fixes? And then what's the rate that you as the city council set? So it's really those 30 factors that go into it. As you all know, the only part you really have control over is the tax rate. So the first part, the valuations, is set by the county. So this year, for our fiscal year, this is what we do know from assessed valuation standpoint, is our assessed valuations increased by 76 million or 2%. And again, this is the 100% value. This isn't what people are taxed on. This is the 100% of everything. Only increased by 2%. So you can kind of see what made up that increase. Now you may say, well, how can we have an increase of 76 million but residential went up by 153? Well, you can see that the multi-residential went down by 98, and why it went down is because now that it's taxed the same as residential, they just took that property and put it in, lumped it in with residential. So really, we don't show a multi-residential classification anymore, so that's why it's a negative. So I guess the point being, of the 153 of the residential increase, 98 of it was just moving the multi-residential into the residential category. So that's what really made up our 76 million. If you're interested, last year we had an increase of assessed values of 7%, or 245 million. So as you can see, we only had an increase of 2%. So very minimal. The next slide shows that why that is also is because there was no countywide revaluation this year. Those are done on odd years. For those of you that been here for a few years, you know that those always happen in those odd years. So because we're on fiscal year 24, that did not. So again, for a citizen understanding that, what it means if my house was valued at 100,000 before, it's still valued at 100,000. There was no countywide reassessment on that. So the second piece, the rollback, that's what we were just talking about a little bit before. So, on the residential side, we're kind of stuck, but we can at least talk a little bit about some of the things we do know. So again, I mentioned multi-residential just to kind of refresh everybody's memory. So multi-residential had an 8-year phase-in to reach the residential rollback. So you can see at one point they were taxed at 100%. Now over the 8-year, they have been phasing in. So now is the year, FY24 is the year that they're now taxed the same as residential. And when I first did the slide, I had that was at 56.49. Well, now as we know that's maybe more at 54%. So again, this was kind of finally that year that we got to. So a significant decrease when they were taxed at 63.75 for FY23. Now they're down to what will be 54 for most likely for FY24. Commercial rollback. They've been at 90% now for several years, so that's still the same. They'll be at 90% for FY24. And then just kind of a reminder about backfill funding. So everybody remembers that when the commercial property tax rollback was decreased, the state had what they called backfill. And so, and this was same chart you would have seen last year, is that, so for FY17, the backfill, or after FY17, the backfill was not guaranteed. And so we, as City of Cedar Falls, we, for the budget years FY18 through FY22, we assumed we would not get the backfill revenue, and then if we did, we would use that for one-time capital projects. So you can see there, it's about, you know, the numbers we're talking about is about 600,000 that we're talking about. Now, with legislation last year, is kind of the next chart, which they basically said they're gonna do an 8-year phase out now of the backfill. So I think for all of us, as much as we want the backfill, I also appreciate that they also were willing to phase it in so we can plan for that. So we're in a 8-year phase out for that. So about every year we're losing about 74,000 that we're losing each year. So what we do now is that because we know it's in the 8-year phase out, we budget for the revenue and then budget for an offsetting capital project to use that for. So that's about a 400 and some thousand number for FY24. Other thing about commercial though that is new this year is last year there was legislation, and people may or may not remember this, but it was called a business property tax reimbursement. House File 2552 last year. So what it's basically doing now is for businesses, the first 150,000 of their valuation is taxed at the residential. So I had a $500,000 business before. I was taxed at 500,000 times 90%. Now I'm taxed at the first 150,000 is at the 54%. Then the remaining of the 350,000 will be taxed at 90%. Now, the state is appropriating funds to backfill us for that money. So for us, that's about a 330,000 that they're estimating. They will admit it's it's a little hard to estimate that, but that's what our estimation is for Cedar Falls. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is that them doing the correction on the residential backfill also affects then commercial valuations, because the first 150,000, what we thought was going to be taxed at 56%, is now going to be taxed at the 54%, assuming the legislation passes. So that's the piece that's tough for us to estimate. You know, with the residential piece, we could take the residential value, divide by the 56, times the 54, and we got a pretty good idea what we're losing. That was that 430,000. But we can't really estimate is what's this first 150,000 on every business that's also being affected. Now, in theory, they're supposed to be backfilling, so it should be neutral to us, but it's kind of hard, again, for us to know what that number is until the county does all of the recalculations again. So that's what kind of makes that tough. So, I already mentioned about residential rollback. That's, you know, again, kind of the story for the night is them, if the legislation does pass, then, you know, we'll go down to the 54. You can kind of see historically the rollback kind of goes up and down and fluctuates over the years, but really this chart would look different now going to 54. That kind of last piece would be just kind of a flat level. I think what also everybody understands is that whenever the residential rollback goes up, the tax burden naturally shifts to residential. If it goes down, tax burden's shifting over to commercial and industrial. Again, still waiting for the rollback figure. I think, you know, for us, I think it's just I think it's pretty good indication that it's going to happen and it's going to pass. So I think probably for us, we're just sitting here, the sooner the better, so we know for sure. And I'm sure every county person is also doing the same thing. Just let us know so we can start doing the recalculations. Obviously for Cedar Falls, why we're always interested in the residential rollback is because, as you can see, we're about 78% residential, so we're always interested in the rollback. It has a major impact on Cedar Falls. Many other communities might be 50-50. Again, with us being 78%, it does have a big impact. So the last piece, I guess we just talked about that, last piece is the tax rate. Again, would have loved to come here tonight, kind of show you where we're kind of sitting, where we think we're at. We had kind of looked at, okay, maybe where we're at, new legislation, maybe we could be around 1165, but again, there's just too many unknowns with the valuation. We also talked about, could we come here tonight, set the max levy, because you can always go down. So we thought, okay, but then again, the valuations on the posted and published notice wouldn't be correct. So again, we just felt like too many unknowns. If they're going to allow for an extension, then maybe it's time to just take a step back get all of the factors before we try to come and talk about one thing and then it changes. So kind of on a pause right now about tax rate. Again, just thought it might be worthwhile tonight, even though we're on a pause, just to talk about some of the other things going on in the budget, just to kind of at least get the discussion going on some of those. Hotel motel tax revenue. For FY24, our plan is to kind of budget back up to what we'd call the normal. Obviously with COVID, we had some reduced revenue in a couple years, so we will be looking at kind of budgeting something back up to the normal of 900,000. We feel like that's still probably a conservative estimate at 900,000. That's our hope. But again, we'd rather plan for that, and if we get more, great. But we don't really want to over budget and then have less come in. What does this impact? Parks, cultural tourism. That's exactly what the hotel motel tax goes for. Also, 54,000 set aside for grants to outside agencies. Also, just on outside agency funding, economic development funding. These are things that were talked about at goal setting, that our Cedar Falls Economic Development Group, to really kind of treat them and grow Cedar Valley the same, about giving them 30,000 as a base and a 32,000 as an incentive. So again, that's what right now we've put in our budget, because that's what we felt like was the direction at goal setting. Obviously, as the budget process moves along, if those amounts want to change, obviously the council can do that, but that is what we had planned for right now. Other things that a lot of times for outside agency funding, there's other funding sources. Health Trust, there is no proposed funding of any applications this year because of the interest rate being so low a year ago, and how we do that calculation based off of prior interest. So there's none of those in here. Block grant, it's just around 40,000 that is out of Black grant that would go for some service agencies. The municipal band, funded at 35,000. That's the same as FY23. That's what their budget request. Everybody probably remembers we're one of the unique cities in Iowa that actually have the band levy. I think one of 3 or something, I think, in Iowa. So that one's a little unusual. And then Met Transit actually put in a request for a 4% increase. So again, as we've been working through the budget, that's what we've put in for them right now, the 474,000 that we'll be budgeting for FY24. Just kind of some other things about the budget, just overall things, is that for many years we have not used the 27-cent emergency levy. This may change, depending on our valuation effects. That might be something we'd have to look at. For now, we've incorporated anything in the FY24 column of the CIP into the budget. We kind of talked about all that at the CIP, but that's what we have for right now. EMA, I think probably, for us, we really have 2 big things that we have the state legislation going on from the revenue side that's kind of put us at a pause, but then from the expense side, what we're kind of waiting for is the EMA. So just a little bit about that is there's been discussion about should the EMA be funded, continually funded by like each city levying them out, or should it be a county-wide levy? And I know there's been lots of discussion. My understanding is I think they're leaning toward moving to a county-wide levy, but that it would not go into effect for FY24, that they would probably wait until FY25 to do that. And I'm guessing it's the same thing for every city involved. They're probably like, okay, we just need to know one way or the other. We either need to know whether we have to include it in our budget or we don't need to know. So I think that's probably the consideration they're giving of, hey, we got some work to do, we got 28Es to update, probably can't get that all done for FY24, so we're probably gonna have to push that to FY25. So the point is we still will be including those costs in our budget then for FY24. Other big question I think going on at that level is also what are they gonna budget at? So as much as I can sit here and say we're going to have to include the EMA costs in our budget, we don't necessarily know what those are yet. There's been talk about whether they're budgeting at 100%, 125. I think the other concern sometimes is just what is that budget oversight for EMA? I think sometimes people are a little nervous about, if they're talking about budget costs, what's going to help control those costs in the future. And I think all of those things have to be answered, and because they'll obviously have an effect on our budget. Just to give you some idea, perspective, If EMA is budgeting at 100%, that's $682,000 for Cedar Falls. If they decide to go to 125%, that's $895,000. So significant differences. Again, hard to kind of plan for a budget when we may be talking about a $200,000 swing in what the cost for EMA might be. So we really would like to get that piece also kind of settled so we know where we're at. Salaries and benefits. So as you may all recall, we've in the second year of 5-year union contracts, so we would be looking at salary increases in that 3 to 5% range, which is part of those salary or those union settlements. For now in the budget, we do have the new positions outlined that were outlined at goal setting, so they're in there for now. Again, as we move along the budget process, those are things that can be discussed as well. Other things that we do know is, I feel like that's what the presentation is tonight. What do we know and what we don't know? But salary and benefits. So IBERS, which is what most of the city employee pension system is in, that will remain the same at 9.44% for FY24. And I should have just noted that, you know, and that always shares that cost. So the city's putting in like a 60%, employees are putting in 40%. So that remains the same, that equal employee and employer share. 411 pension, or the municipal police and fire, their rate for FY24 is actually going to decrease slightly. You can see from 23.9 to 22.9, so that's always a good thing when it goes down. So we will see a decrease in the rate, but for FY24, as it stands right now, we'd be looking at property tax support of about $1.1 million to support those costs. And just like the current year, try to use some cash to help reduce that support and keep that levy rate down. So that's kind of the parameters for what we're looking at right now for FY24. I think, you know, as always when we're putting in a budget together, we're also trying to look ahead. What are our challenges looking ahead? And from a revenue side, we just talked about the backfill. We know that's going to continue to go down each year. The new business property tax credit, so again, that was that $330,000. Will the state continue to fund that as they say they're doing right now? Will that continue? I mean, history normally tells us that would not continue. It's just when. You know, and then we also know what other state legislation may occur. You know, I think for most of you, we had the meeting with our local legislators last Friday, and you know, continue to hear that there's property tax reform, could be changes to TIF, and so again, not knowing down the road what impacts that might have it on Cedar Falls. Other thing is we're going to continue to watch the residential rollback, and I don't mean just the correction for this year. There's been some things floating out there that they're estimating that for next year that could fall to 49% for Cedar Falls. If you took that, that's a $1.7 million loss to our general fund if it would go down that much. Now again, that's just things they're estimating and calculations out there, but again, things we want to watch for the future as we move in to the FY25 budget. On the expense side then, what's our challenges? I mean, probably ones that all of you know what our challenges are from expense side. Health insurance costs and benefits, personnel costs, inflation effects, construction costs. I mean, we just know. Those are all the things, the challenges we're going to have on the expense side moving forward. You know, kind of also though for us, I think we always like to know, well, what are still those some tools we have if those things happen? Down to 49% residential rollback, what do we have for tools? Well, we know that, you know, we've been paying for some capital projects with saved up funds. We've been trying to save some of our TIF release for future economic development. One of the other tools we have, I mentioned earlier, is the 27-cent emergency levy. If we needed that, that's $574,000 we can gain. Now again, that is an increase. I mean, that's an increase in your levy, but that is a tool we have. So lastly, this was the original budget schedule we had kind of outlined. We really thought we were going to come here tonight, on council tonight, set the max levy hearing for in 2 weeks, flow through the process, you know, then set the hearing, you know, have that hearing, set the hearing for the next one, have that hearing, you know, the first meeting of March, so we're make sure we're good for our deadline on the end of March. Well, putting a pause on things right now, when I did the slide, redid the slide last Wednesday, this is what we thought maybe an updated budget schedule might be, is really just moving everything back 2 weeks. And I originally didn't know if it was April 30th or April 15th they were going to top out. Now, again, still not knowing where exactly they're going to pass the bill, when the county will take to redo valuations, what are we going to know about EMA? I'm not even sure if this is the right schedule yet. Now, again, the good thing is it looks like they're giving us till April 30th, so hopefully. But again, I think for all of us, you get a little anxious. You kind of want to get this process going, and we just had the CIP. We kind of are all in that budget way of thinking right now, and usually the sooner the better. So next step, again, could have hoped you'd done a max levy tonight and published that, but unfortunately we're going to have to delay some things till more information is received. Didn't put it up here, I guess, but obviously for us, our plan would be probably, coming back to another presentation to tell you where we're at, the things we thought we would include tonight that we couldn't, but at least wanted to give you some of those other parameters so we maybe don't have to cover that next time, some about pension costs, some of that, some factors we do know. So I guess that's where we're kind of at right now. So I guess I'll leave it up for questions.
Any questions for Director Rodenbeck?
Madam Chair.
Councilman Cruz, go ahead.
Couple things. On the Met funding, is that based on miles driven in our community or passengers in Cedar Falls, or how do you split that with Waterloo? Or is there, how's that work?
So Met has a funding formula that they use for their routes, and I think it is miles of routes. But then my understanding in the past is that Route 9 kind of had a different, it used to be we had a different exact amount for Route 9. And then I would say 2-3 years ago, Route 9 just became part of that formula as well. So this is, again, based on that and their costs and their budget, that's what they're asking for, is a 4% increase.
Just kind of curious. On the EMA levy, what sort of time frame we look there to get a solution?
Well, what I just heard this morning was that they wanted to meet this Thursday, but because of the publication notice, that they're not able to do that, so now they won't be able to meet about it until February 23rd.
Okay.
That's why I kind of paused about we might be pushing things back even more. Now, if we get some indication about that, maybe we can move ahead. And again, we could do like a lot of things. We can set our max levy high, and we can always go down, so we know we can do that. But again, it's a pretty big unknown.
Okay, and then lastly, given the inflation we've seen in the last year, what cuts is the city looking at doing to trim back and hopefully be neutral, if even possible?
Well,
property tax increase.
Sure. I think we came, before all this legislation stuff kind of came out 2 weeks ago, we came here feeling like we kind of had done some of that, gone through and looked at where do we feel like we can do that. And we were looking at what are some other things that we wanted, maybe some direction from council, whether you wanted to do that. For instance, like the staffing additions that we talk about, goal setting, had them in there, but are those things we could have talked about with the council about, okay, if you want to reduce things further, here's what those additional requests were. Do we not want to consider those now? So we kind of felt like we were there and coming here, and then this kind of all blew up over the past 2 weeks, and so now we feel like, again, we're kind of on pause about that. So, but we felt like that's what we were trying to do, because we felt like we heard the direction from council, and so we were trying to do the best we can to get there, I guess. I don't know, Ron, if you have anything more you feel like you want to add to that, but.
No, I think really we'll have to, once we figure out some of these unknowns, and we get some hard numbers to figure out where we are percentage-wise and levy rate, we'll have to sit down with the council and like Jen said, is are there areas that we want to look at cutting? So.
Because the reason I bring that up, if you got a 2% increase in valuation, if we kept the millage rate the same, you got an increase in property tax. Citizens need to know that. I mean, as their property rises in value.
Sure.
And
sure.
Last summer and spring with the big run up in real estate sales and price wars almost. Properties going 30,000 more than list and so on, or more, that it's going to reflect in their property taxes going higher, even though we didn't spend more at the city budget.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, again, that's why it's just hard, I mentioned about the residential rollback and that property tax shift. I mean, it really does matter. I mean, even if, like you said, if you wanted to collect the same dollars, that rollback will impact who's that shifting on to, residential or commercial, if you do the exact same. By that rollback going down from 56 to 54, it's just switching that back more on to commercial at that point.
Madam Chair?
Councilman Ganfield?
Yep. Just a point of curiosity, I don't want to put you on the spot. You can certainly say I don't have that answer. But looking at, I think it's slide page 20 for us, but it's the distribution of total property values by type. You mentioned that we're always paying attention because our residential is so heavy for Cedar Falls. Do you have any numbers or sense of whether that's atypical by comparison to other municipalities, or we don't know those comparatives?
Well, I can speak generally about that, and what I mean by that is I know that probably Johnston is very similar to us in having a high residential, but you pick probably Waterloo, Des Moines, some of those, they're probably more like 60-40, 50-50. So we are unusual, but that doesn't mean there's not, and when you really, you can kind of almost think about where that probably is. When you think about those suburbs around Des Moines, they're probably gonna be highly residential as well. You think around Iowa City, it's probably not Cedar Rapids. I mean, they're probably not higher residential, but when you think about the North Liberties and some of those, they're probably the ones that have that high residential. So again, I don't know exactly, but it does vary greatly between that. But if that's something you're interested in, we can sure find that information out.
Yeah, I'll set up an opportunity to come visit a little bit
Okay.
further. I think it's worth noting, though, that that's kind of why we as a city are having a push towards the industrial park to kind of try and diversify and
Right.
ease that tax burden off of our citizens a little bit better.
Yeah.
Yes, Councilman Schultz?
So, Jennifer, how would that work with the emergency, the EMA? If the 600,000 or more, then we wouldn't pay that from the city to the county, but then the county would tax directly to the residents.
Correct.
So that would change
Correct.
but we don't know that until we know it, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So one way or another, residents are still paying for it.
Right.
It's just how they're paying for it. Is it through the city tax levy or their county tax levy? Yep.
Any further questions for Director Rodenbeck? All right, thank you for all the information.
Yeah,
That is
more
the
to
only
come.
thing, yes, that's the only thing on tonight's agenda for the Finance and Business Operations Committee. So we will adjourn this meeting and reconvene at 7 o'clock for our regular city council meeting.
I gotta get a little clock back.